those funds were given both to state and local agencies. So you can see they've broken it out by type of government, partially because of how those agencies receive their funds. So the top left is the state. It was a little over about 5.5 billion. The 26 largest municipalities is in the bottom left. That was almost 750 million, which is a lot. The 100 counties was is this billion? No, it's billion. I can't keep up with these commas. 2 billion. And then the remaining, which are non-entitlement units, which is anyone that is not a metro community, 50,000 residents or less, received about $705 million. So quite a lot of funding. So I'm going to talk, before we dive into like the ins and outs of the local government items, I wanted to touch a little bit on the state programs, because as I noted, there's some relevant state programs. So this is a not comprehensive, but highlight of programs that you might know of or be asked about that are being partially funded by ARPA funding. And the reason that I wanted to note this is that as we'll get into, there's sort of this concept of revenue replacement for smaller local governments, which means they don't have to follow a lot of the ARPA sort of requirements. And I know in our region, we've seen sort of this glazing over now of those folks who are like, I don't need to deal with the full scope of ARPA. My funding is revenue replacement. If they're getting funding in some of these programs, they may be getting ARPA funding, and then they may have to deal with ARPA. So it's just something to keep in mind as we are tracking who's getting these awards. There is not a very seamless way to track, because some of these programs, like some of the awards are ARPA and some of them are state funding. I know the Great Grants is that way because some of it is just General Assembly allocations, but several of the broadband programs, including, I believe, another one that's coming out in January, are all partially ARPA. A lot of DEQ funding that's been rolling out. So we've all been probably, if you've been aware, there's been a massive amount of funding going to DEQ for water and sewer infrastructure. The stormwater program specifically is fully ARPA funding, and then some of the other programs are supplemented. Our funding and the funding that's gone to the League of Municipalities and the Association of County Commissioners is ARPA funding, and then the Rural Transformation Grant Fund, which I know is of note to many small communities. That similarly is not necessarily ARPA funding, but it can be ARPA funding. So sort of a not helpful piece of news, but it is just something I know I've been sort of keeping note of who in our region is getting some of this funding. It's just good to sort of remind people that if they've gotten some of these grants, they have to sort of reevaluate what they thought about ARPA. One other thing, though, to note about this is that each of these state agencies is kind of formalizing their own approach to ARPA. So we'll talk a little bit about it from the COG perspective in terms of how our state agency who's overseeing us has taken the approach of ARPA funding, but what's important to note is that unfortunately you can't assume that what we're sort of telling local governments for their own funding applies to these ARPA funds. Each of the state agencies should have sort of communications about them, but they might have a different interpretation of how it rolls out. So any questions on this item? Yeah, I will say there was a little bit of a panic a while back from a couple of us in the COGS when we started realizing that the Rural Transformation Grant Fund was partially ARPA because it's mostly smaller communities, rural communities. So it was like, oh, okay. Now we got to figure out who got these funds. Do they know that it's potentially ARPA? There was another, it was also the earmark. So if folks got earmarks in the General Assembly, there was a few that were ARPA funding. So just something to keep in mind. So this link that's on this slide includes a dashboard of all of the places that ARPA funding went from the state. So this is all on that state ARPA funding pot. All right, so local ARPA funds. So this is, at least in my understanding, it's definitely the first time. There's some assumption that it may be the only time that every local government in the United States gets direct funding from the federal government without having to apply in some way. So it's a very sort of unique program that may or may not ever happen again. And it's overseen by the US Department of Treasury. So we'll talk about this. I'm sure most of you at this point have at least in some way interacted with Treasury. The funds are based on a formula using population size, and I'll note this for everyone that the formula is the same as the one that is used for CBDG, so they sort of rolled over that same formula. So if you know that formula, you know the formula for these funds, but they obviously applied it to every community, which is not normally the case with CBDG. The funds were dispersed in 2 rounds. So at this point, every local government should theoretically have received all of their funding. I'll talk about where different folks would have received it from, but they should have theoretically gotten the first round in summer 2021 and the second round in the summer of 2022. I know that we had a couple of folks that had questions about that over the period of time of like, how did we get the funds? Did we get the funds? Do we need to go do something to get the funds? They should at this point have had that resolved. And if they haven't, you can work with them to get the funding. For smaller communities, their funding is coming directly from the NC Pandemic Recovery Office, not from Treasury. So it makes it a little bit easier. So I wanted to note, this is not comprehensive, and these are just 2 separate examples. So the picture on the right and the text on the left are 2 different examples of how government type impacts process. So I think a lot of you have probably kind of determined this, the larger the community, the more they need to pay attention to different things, and the process is different. The smaller ones obviously have sort of reduced burden. So the way that Treasury has sort of identified what a community is by these phrases called metro city, county, which is what we know as a county, and then non-entitlement units. And I did not get into the weeds of all of the differences that go into play with metro cities, counties, and non-entitlement units, but I did want to indicate where they're sort of interacting with. So if you'll notice, the metro cities and the counties, of all sizes, so this is not like counties above a certain size, counties of all sizes directly are working with US Treasury. So they are not going through the Pandemic Recovery Office in any way. So I know really early on there was actually a lot of confusion about that with counties because they were delineating by population. And so counties that were smaller started worrying, they didn't know who to go to. Was it Treasury? Was it Pandemic Recovery Office? They are going directly through Treasury. And so that means that they've had to, by now, theoretically, set up accounts with Treasury, request funding from Treasury, apply for future funding from Treasury. All of that for those larger communities happens through the Treasury system only. And then sticking on the size, if you look on the table on the right, they have substantially more reporting requirements that are also all done to Treasury. So metro cities and counties, well, actually, metro cities and large counties. So that's where that's why I was trying not to get too into the weeds, but this table will indicate sort of by size and by dollar amount what reports are due. So smaller counties end up falling into a less burdensome reporting requirement. And this table is a very easy way to understand it. So you can see based on the recipient, if they have a project and expenditure report due and how often. So the larger they are, the more likely they have each quarter a report. And then most of our communities will have that annual one that's done at the end of April. So that's the one that most of us have had to work with folks on. But larger counties and metro cities have a quarterly report. And then there's also an additional expectation for those larger communities to do a recovery plan performance report, which has to be done every year. So sort of a range of expectations. Non-entitlement units, which is anyone below 50,000, they work mostly with the Pandemic Recovery Office. So they submitted their initial documentation to the NC Pandemic Recovery Office. They received their funds. So those different amounts that they've received came from the Pandemic Recovery Office. The only thing that they're doing with Treasury is submitting their annual reports and potentially asking questions of Treasury. But the only interaction that those smaller communities have to have with Treasury at this point is submitting those reports that are due each spring. Any questions or any like thoughts that anyone has that I haven't touched on about size? Okay. Some of this might not be new news to everyone, but so this I've completely stolen from Kara Malanzi because it's the best way to just convey this information. So credit to Kara. So these are the eligible uses for the ARPA funds for local governments. There's 4 categories for, I'm not going to get into the weeds of each of them. There's the address COVID public health and negative economic impact, replace lost revenue, premium pay, and necessary infrastructure investments. The thing to note is obviously that most communities can do only replace lost revenue. So one thing that's come up with us a number of times, and we'll talk about revenue replacement in a minute, is folks saying, well, I want to do infrastructure investment with my funds. Do I need to not do it in the replace lost revenue? If they have less than $10 million, which is the standard allowance for replace lost revenue, they should always do revenue replacement, even if their project is in one of these other eligible uses. So that is very confusing to people. It's sort of like seems too good to be true. I actually just yesterday, which makes me a little nervous, but it's okay, saw a question from Raleigh saying, we're not sure about revenue replacement. We're really worried about it. It seems too good to be true. It does seem to be too good to be true, but that's fine, right? Like Treasury has acknowledged it. So I guess backing up just to make sure everyone knows, revenue replacement is this second category. The concept behind it is that it gives you the opportunity to elect for a $10 million standard allowance instead of calculating if you lost revenue. And for the majority of local governments, they received less than $10 million. So all of their funding falls into this category. And then once you're in that category, there's really, really, really reduced burden in terms of compliance, and there's greater sort of eligible uses. So you can do anything that falls into this concept of government services, which is very broad. So normally you can't fund sort of like general government service with federal funding. In this category, you can. So it does seem too good to be true, but I think it's just Treasury's way of dealing with the fact that they know it's burdensome for really small communities who have probably not received this money before to deal with this program. And I also think they don't have the ability to monitor everyone. So this is a way to sort of say, we know a lot of you lost revenue during the pandemic. Here is a standard allowance. You can use this category. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on the other eligible uses. The School of Government's A to Z course, which is on capital improvements, covers a water and sewer project and a housing project, I think. Is that correct?
I think it was just water and sewer, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, maybe they were thinking about doing a housing project, so that will be coming. But they definitely did a water and sewer one. Again, that if you have no communities that receive more than $10 million, none of the other categories should matter, if that makes sense. And it shouldn't matter to them either. So just something to keep in mind. They can replace lost revenue for all of their funds. It does seem too good to be true, but they should still do it.
And definitely encourage them to do that because some of them are very confused about it and they want to do something in the other categories. But if they have the less than 10 million, that's going to be their easiest compliance by far. So,
yeah. And then for the larger community, so that still relates for larger communities. So if they got more than $10 million, they can still have $10 million go into the be revenue replacement, and then have the remaining of their funds fall into some other category. The other thing that they can do is there is a formula where you can try and estimate how much revenue you lost. So I know in our region, Wake County did that. I have no idea how they finagle the numbers because I don't really money. knowing how this region is growing, but I think they spent a lot of money on like vaccines and all these other things. And so they were able to show how much revenue loss they had, which was much higher than 10 million and gave them some more flexibility. So that's something to note for larger communities. They can do the formula approach. For some people, the formula approach does not even get them to 10 million. I know we had another county that it just didn't even make sense. They just took 10 million because they were going to end up with 7 million or something even smaller. But so that way it gives them the flexibility. So everyone should theoretically have $10 million of revenue loss, regardless of how much money they received. That said, you don't get $10 million of funding if you got $2 million just because you say you lost $10 million. You get up to whatever they originally gave you. So you're sort of claiming that amount, but it's just covering all of your funding. Compliance requirements. So this is a very sort of busy slide, but it covers a lot of stuff in one place, which I think is really helpful. So there's 3 buckets here. The award terms are the things that apply to everyone that got funding. So this is like, you got the funds from the federal government, you have to follow these rules, these sort of pieces. You have to obligate your funds, which means you've budgeted where they're going. So obligating is not necessarily spending. It's like you've put it into a budget and said, you know, there's a contract in place is probably the best way to say that. So they have to be sort of obligated by December 31st, 2024 and spent by December 31st, 2026. This is not an official sort of like piece of the training, but our lobbyist has mentioned that there is a lot of conversation about extending these dates. So that is something to keep in mind. It doesn't matter for the smaller communities, but it will matter for the larger ones who have had a lot of panic over getting like big capital projects done in this time period. So nothing official to say on that, but there's just been a lot of conversation in Washington, D.C., because I think there's a lot of national organizations saying local governments can't get big projects done in this time period. So something to keep in mind, but for now, those are the deadlines. Those are also the deadlines, which I'll touch on for our work and how we are spending our funding. Everyone has the reporting requirements based on your size. Everyone has to have a civil rights compliance policy. Everyone has to comply with the relevant UG provisions, which I'll touch on based on sort of what project you do. You have to have a records retention policy, and it's a very specific one. So even if folks have a records retention policy, it may not be correct based on what the federal requirements are. And you have to follow specific audit requirements, which depend on how much funding you get from the federal government. Just a note on this slide, so I've linked where we have templates to policies that you can share with folks if they have questions. And I think the School of Government has ones for these, for most of this as well. Some of these are all the School of Government's links that I've put in here, but just something to keep in mind. They're also all on that School of Government website if you need one place with all of that. So yeah.
And the effective dates of those
policies
requirements are what? March of
2021. So yeah, so there is sort of this, I mean, I don't know if I have like a great answer to this, but I know there's a lot of folks. So the legislation went in place in March 3rd, 2021. Folks didn't get their funding until that summer, late summer. And then a lot of them didn't do anything with them for quite some time. So all of this stuff needs to be in place, but if they haven't done anything yet with their funding theoretically, or it needed to be in place before they started spending the funding is basically the case. So it doesn't have to be that they had a policy in place on March 3rd, 2021. It had to be that they have all these things in place for the day that the funding is obligated, if that makes sense. So I know, I mean, we have a couple of communities that are just now adopting their budget ordinances for the funds. So they didn't need to have this in place until now because they weren't doing anything with it. Any other questions on that? The middle one is the prohibited expenditures. So these are things that you cannot do with the funds, even if you're using it for revenue replacement, I think, which is kind of, yeah. So you can't put money into a pension fund. You can't put it into a rainy day fund. You can't borrow money. I thought there was something that I'm actually not seeing here about not raising taxes. Is that not?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I thought you couldn't not raise tax. Yeah, I thought you couldn't lower taxes, but maybe I'm making that one up. Anyway, so this is the list. So you cannot do any of these sorts of things with the funds. Pretty straightforward. And then uniform guidance is this last category. So this is the sort of requirements that are in place for all federal funding, right? So it's not specific to ARPA, but it's related to the fact that it's federal funding. But what is unique about ARPA is that it has some exceptions from uniform guidance if you are using revenue replacement. So that is why revenue replacement is so too good to be true, right? That it sort of is giving you this flexibility from uniform guidance. So the ones that have asterisks next to them do not apply if you have revenue or using revenue replacement.
Yeah. And that's a relatively new exemption from Treasury. I think like July of this year, they said that you no longer had to have these policies. So at the beginning, you did have to have them, and now in July, you don't have to have them anymore.
Yeah.
Although I will point out for procurement, the only thing you do have to follow UG for procurement under revenue replacement for audit, for a single audit, if you meet the threshold for a single audit. Otherwise, you don't have to follow it for any projects, but for the single audit, you do still.
Yeah, and I didn't put it into these slides, but if we have time, not to bore everyone with audit on a Friday, but we have a 2-pager we put together on audit that we can pull up and talk about. Because that is like an annoying and sort of, but also important item. And then one other thing on UG, so it's not listed here because it's not required at all for ARPA. So Davis-Bacon, which makes me think of that typing. I don't know if this puts me in a certain age bracket, but if anyone ever did that like typing computer game, that's what it makes me think of. But it's the thing related to wages and other things related to that. Does not apply at all to ARPA. The only time that it does is if you're doing a capital project that is using other federal funding, like as a coupled. So if you're coupling ARPA with other federal funds that require it, which makes it's pretty straightforward. So that is nice. That's a whole nother set of sort of requirements that do not apply to ARPA. Any questions on any of this? Cool. And this slide really is another one from Kara that I stole. That if it's all in one, this is all in one place, which is really nice. So there's obviously lots of sort of nuance to some of these items, but this is pretty straightforward in terms of whatever the award terms is everyone, prohibited expenditures is everyone, uniform guidance is everyone. So this is like the stuff you need to know no matter what. So. Any questions in general about ARPA? I haven't put anyone to sleep.
I feel like that'll be later with the real life example.
You have a question about audit?
Um,
You can talk about it now, it doesn't matter.
okay.
Doesn't
Well,
matter.
I was just, trying to remember the context of this. Does the alternative compliance audit replace a single audit, or is it in addition to a single audit? I don't even know if that's applicable now that I'm thinking about it, because I don't know that our communities are gonna qualify for.
So it depends on what they qualify for.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to qualify for a single audit to need the alternative.
Right, but then there's additional qualifications for the alternative audit, but it would replace the single audit if they qualify for it. So
Okay,
you
if
wouldn't
they-
do both,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And I know there's some guidance on that, that I can find and share out on the alternative audit. I think we put something about
We
it in
did
our
put it in
little
our
audit
thing.
guidance, sheet, so let me see if I can go ahead and find that and pop it in the chat too,
Yeah.
the audit
Okay,
guidance. But yeah, it would not be both, it would be either one.
okay.
Yeah. And so audit has a lot of like thresholds related to it, and so we'll talk a little bit about it, but we also, that sheet she's gonna share talks about the thresholds.
Okay,
Because you don't need, the single audit doesn't even apply unless you have 750,000 of federal money in 1 year, and you have to spend it. It's not that you have it, it's that you spent it.
Yeah.
Which is a good distinction that our CFO reminded us of. So even if like a local government got 750,000 of ARPA funding, if they only spent 200,000, then it doesn't apply.
And then it's 500,000 for state funding.
okay. Yeah, so that's only some of our communities anyways, but that's just good to know.
Yeah, audit is definitely the one that like, I think stresses up. I mean, me and Tara, we're like always bugging our
Well-
finance person about it too, because
Because everything else gets so much emphasis and then it's like, oh, just the audit. And it's like, oh, wait, but
that's where they're gonna
that's
cap.
really important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think so, it came up in one of our recent meetings. I think it was with larger communities, and that's why it came up, but some folks have gone through audits. Some of the smaller ones potentially have not gone through an audit yet with their funding because they hadn't spent it
Mhm.
until this year, or even, this funding year, right? So if they didn't spend anything until July of this year, which is kind of far into the funding, but a lot of folks didn't, then they're not going through audit season right now related to their ARPA funds, because audit's dealing with last year. So a number of folks will have their first audit next year
Okay.
with ARPA funds.
And I'm playing catch up. I joined like in October, so I'm still trying.
Yeah, no, that's
Catch
fine.
up,
That's
but-
why we're doing that.
Everybody, like the other, all communities should have already decided what category they're spending within.
So I'll talk about that a little bit of how they can do that,
Okay.
but if they haven't done it and if they haven't decided and they haven't spent any funding,
Mhm.
like, I think there's some concern that Treasury is gonna pay attention to them, but there's no issue if they haven't spent funding. So if they haven't done anything with the money and they also haven't made any decisions, sort of like, okay, let's make some decisions, that's
Mhm.
fine. The issue is if they've spent funding and didn't do anything to sort of indicate how they were gonna go about that.
Okay.
So I'll do a really quick rundown of like the steps of like setting up for deciding. It's relatively specific to revenue replacement, but it could apply to any category. Any other questions before we go on? Well, we will have a section that I think might be more like specific to that. And then if I still haven't covered something that you have a question about, just let me know.
And I shared that audit guidance in the chat, so if anyone wants to reference that. And I'm also just gonna share the local assistance for tribal and community fund. I think I got that name right. I always want to call it Latch, but it's like LATCF.
Yeah, there's
Mhm.
technically.
There's not a
no-
really good way to say it. I'm gonna share that in the chat as well.
Awesome. So I'm gonna talk quickly, or just talk through sort of our funding, so the funding that we're all using to charge for ARPA, because it is sort of, it does give you probably some guidance on, and some sort of context on like what we're doing, why we have this funding, what we're supposed to do with it. So amidst that really large slide that I had of all the different programs that have ARPA funding in them, one of the things that they put ARPA funding towards was funding specifically for the Association of Regional Councils of Government. It's the ARPA, which is the association that all of us are sort of within. So all of our COGs participate in that association. All of our executive directors are on the board of that association, et cetera. So $10 million was given in ARPA funding to the association. That allocation does fall under revenue replacement. So that's notable. So what the funding that we're spending, that we are using, that's ARPA funds, are revenue replacement, which just sort of alleviates some of the burden around our funding, which is always nice. I think the state did that on purpose, just for our benefit. We are under, so state agencies depending on whatever state agency received the funding and is managing you is sort of who you work with. So the Pandemic Recovery Office is our state agency that is overseeing our work. So if you've already attended one of the monthly meetings that we hold, you may have heard from Neil, who came on, who is from the Pandemic Recovery Office. He's our contact, who is sort of overseeing our funding. And what I've included here is just a couple of little blurbs that are from our direct agreement with NC Pro, explaining what we are all going to do with our funding. So this is like the explicit purpose that they gave us funding for. So providing technical assistance and planning guidance to units of local government, and working with local governments in the areas of recovery planning, technical assistance, and regional exchange networks, and sort of providing on-the-ground assistance. So this is specifically from our contract, and I'll go through the 3 different goals. They're very broad, and it's meant to be broad because I think there was an acknowledgement that each cog is going to do something different. But it's sort of these recovery planning, technical assistance, exchange networks are the 3 buckets of work. This is this is a fun little slide about what is a subrecipient and the fact that we are a subrecipient. So this could come up with local governments as well. But so the association is a subrecipient of the state. And then each of us, our organizations, are a subrecipient of the association. So it's sort of this full expectation funneling down. What's important about being a subrecipient, and I actually have another slide about this farther on that I might go to in a second. So the difference, so subrecipient versus being like a contract, when you're a subrecipient, you're basically being considered an extension of the organization that gave you that funding. So whatever the state is required to do with ARPA funding, we have that requirement as well. We're basically sort of, you're given funding to do something programmatic. It's not sort of a, you give money, we do something, you buy something from us. It's a relationship rather than like a contract. So the association is subject to monitoring by the state, which is why Neil is sort of hanging out with us. We have reporting requirements to the state. We have to follow the UG requirements. So we've already gone through this with all of your organizations, getting you sort of having you adopt policies. So we've all adopted the same policies that we're asking our local governments to adopt, right? So at least if they have revenue replacement. So we've put in place the civil rights policy. We've put in place the conflict of interest policy.
Eligible use.
Yeah.
Records retention.
Yeah.
I think
something
that might
else.
be it.
Yeah. We've collected all the budgets from everyone. So we have sort of documentation of everyone's like ability to
Mhm.
have internal controls and
And
pass
previous
audits.
audits, if you've had them.
Yeah, and so what we're doing with this, the reason I mention this more than partly because it's just useful to know, but also because this process that you've all gone through to get your funding is the same process that a local government would do for their funding and then for a sub-award. So something notable to keep in mind. So these are the specific eligible activities. You've seen them if you've done a report to me or Tara before, probably to Tara, sent one in. So it differs based on local, but based on COG, what you're doing, but these are the 3 areas you can do work in: assist local governments in planning for COVID recovery and fund implementation, providing technical assistance, and convening staff on items related to regional recovery and SLFRF implementation. So very broad. I think we've mentioned this in some of the meetings that we've had with everyone. Every COG does not need to do something in each of these 3 buckets. You just have to have your work fall under one of them. So you can submit a report to us that has nothing in the convene section and everything in the other 2. But these are sort of what we've been approved to do by the Pandemic Recovery Office. This was when I was getting really bored with my PowerPoint. So I put this little GIF in. So this is just an example of so this is not even really close to what has been done at this point, because this was only the impact from February to June of all of us. And I think a number of folks had not actually submitted anything at that point because everyone hadn't staffed up. But we've got a pretty good reach going, which is awesome. So we've helped almost 1,000. We that during that time, it's probably much higher now, helped over almost 1,000 people, sent out a significant amount of resources, held a significant amount of planning meetings. So pretty cool. And we'll have more details as we have more reports, but I just wanted to share that because it's cool to see those numbers. Okay, that's everything on so it's pretty straightforward, and I think everyone, if you've been, we've got some documentation if you need more details on process, but we're all subrecipients. So, as you know the subrecipient process of ARPA, you know the process that we're all participating in. So, any questions on like what you can do with your funding, or if you've done work that you're not sure where it would fall or if it can fall under our work?
Elaine, I had a question. I was hoping you could just give us some examples of technical assistance that we could provide to local governments.
Yeah. And so one thing to note, that technical assistance category is really broad. So if you look at what it says in here, project management, monitoring, reporting, grant writing, financial management toolkits, and strategies. And it's included but not limited to. So I can share how we're sort of interpreting that because we've taken a really broad interpretation. And that's partly because most of our communities are sort of done with they're not done with their ARPA funding, but they've gone through the steps. They're set, unless they get a state program grant that is ARPA, they're sort of done with that. But they do still have a lot of needs in terms of recovering, sustainable sort of staffing, things like that. So we are doing a lot of work around grants using ARPA funds. So that is one area that we have sort of seen, like all of the additional federal funds that are coming out, the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of funding coming from the federal government. We are using some of our funding to sort of track and assist with keeping up with all of that funding, because all of it's part of this like federal economic recovery package. So that's one thing we've done. So I don't know if is this the kind of example you want, Carlton, or do you want something more specific?
No, anything. Yeah, anything
Okay.
that's clear.
We've also done like specific to ARPA. We put together some of our 1-pagers or 2-pagers that Tara's sharing would probably fall under this category. So we have an audit 2-pager that sort of is like steps to follow to get to your audit. We've put together a community engagement 1-pager. We've put together
And ARPA resources, like 2-pager.
ARPA resources.
Then there's this LATCF funding 2-pager. And then we've done a lot with for specific grants. We've done a lot of grant summaries for communities and for different folks who wanted them. So kind of to Elena's point, helping with that grant funding, we've done a lot of like summaries of notice of funding opportunities, because those can be like 80 something pages. So we do like ones that are more like 5 to 10 pages. You can only break it down so much to get all the details in, but
Yeah.
things like that.
How are you?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So do those grants have to be related to ARPA?
So we're
Okay.
like seeing it as sort of a comprehensive thing based on the fact that a lot of our local governments are strapped for money. Is sort of how we're interpreting it, right? Like most of it's grants related to water and sewer infrastructure. It's the same sort of things that the ARPA funding was related to. So I think if you see sort of here the effectively planning for COVID recovery and regional recovery, I think that is sort of a broad outlook in terms of, I think obviously if you have communities that are still in need of like figuring out their ARPA funding, that is priority number 1. But we've just sort of reached a point where most of our communities don't need that help as much, except for the really large ones, which need a lot of help. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of other things that small communities still need help with, right? In terms of like being sort of sustainably moving forward. The other thing that this is another example of something broader, is we are also putting some money towards conversations around workforce, public workforce specifically. So not workforce development, but like the sustainability of the public sector workforce for our local governments. All of our local governments can't recruit, they can't retain. they've got workforce challenges, they have burnout, which we're sort of connecting to like an inability to sustain crucial services that either came about during COVID or coming out after COVID. So some of our funding is being dedicated to work on that as well.
So.
Sorry, did you have
okay,
a
so-
question? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Carlton.
Okay, so it's a lot broader than I realized, I guess. Because I've mostly been trying to focus on helping the smaller towns within my region with reporting and compliance, but there's only so much I can do. Reporting and compliance related to ARPA, but there's only so much I can do since quite a few of them have already, spent their funds.
Yeah.
I've just been, David, and Melinda and I have been trying to come up with, some other ideas for what we can use the ARPA, or our ARPA money for.
Yeah, I think obviously like, I mean, and I know Tara especially, not really me, Tara's reviewing reports and making sure folks are sticking with what we're sort of expected to do, but it is broad. It's meant to be broad. Especially since the funding has become so much more flexible. I think there's only so much we can do when folks are just doing revenue replacement, putting it in their general fund, calling it a day, right? But the other thing that we've talked about, and we've struggled with this one a little bit more, but we've tried to have these working groups of our local governments on topics specific that we're assuming, even if they did revenue replacement, they're putting more money into. So like, even if you do revenue replacement, you end up with more money, right? You don't have ARPA anymore, but you still have more money. So we have a water and sewer focused one and a housing one. The housing one actually meets next week. So if anyone's interested in sort of sitting in on that, you're welcome to. But that's for folks who are probably putting a lot of their ARPA money towards housing, but are also trying to think through like future funding of housing projects, both federal and local, and like how to deal with that after their ARPA money goes away. So that's the other piece, is sort of like convening around topics that people are putting their money towards, even if it's not ARPA anymore, if that makes sense. Did you have a question?
Yes, how were you disseminating those, one pagers to your local governments? Is it just emailing them, or are you making presentations before their boards?
We have not been doing board presentations. Maybe we should have. We never did them. No, so we've had a listserv going for quite some time of folks who are specific to ARPA. And we now have a sort of smaller listserv that's just the metro communities that are paying a lot more close attention.
And then it's just been people who've asked for them, or ones we've specifically made for folks and then shared out. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
And I think we posted some of them to our website as well.
yeah.
Not that I don't know how many people actually look at that.
Yeah, we're working on that right now.
Mhm.
I think this falls into this category, but, you know, we have, I think, at least one county that they did revenue replacement, and now they're struggling to decide how to use those funds. Is that something that you guys have gotten involved in or tried to help with?
Yes.
With any of your counties?
I don't think we've had as much. I don't think there's been as many communities that don't know what to do with their funding around here. I feel like everyone is like going crazy with water, sewer investments and things like that. But we've been trying to push that message of like, let's still talk about what we're doing with our ARPA funds, even if it's revenue replacement. Because it also does feel a little weird that everyone's like no longer got ARPA. It makes me more just, I think it's why revenue replacement's weird, right? It's like everyone now just doesn't have ARPA funding and can kind of do whatever, and we may never know what they actually did with it, and there's probably a lot of good investments, and so like keeping track of that would still be really great.
And what we're running into is they don't, like our board doesn't have a timeline now for like actually completing the use of the funds. So they're kind of just taking their time, but yeah, okay, so that's interesting. And, okay, the other one's for another category, so that's just trying to come up with stuff.
No, those are all good
As I go.
questions. Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, go
you
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say Betsy has her hand up as
Oh.
well in the chat.
Go ahead, Betsy.
Hey, thanks. So one thing that I've been doing, spending a small amount of time on, but it is significant, is helping some towns apply for grant money that was either non-ARPA or was state ARPA money, like the Rural Transformation Grant out of NC Commerce. So would that be, that's reportable, I assume, under our subrecipient agreement, even if
Yes.
the rural transformation was state ARPA funds. There may be other grants that are non-ARPA, but would help communities recover and do their thing, right? And so you're nodding because that is reportable, I see. Okay,
Yeah, we
great.
do that as
Thank
well.
you.
Yeah, we do that as well. Yeah.
Great.
Cool. Any other questions about that before we move on?
No, but that's really good to hear. So we can basically use non-ARPA again, non-ARPA related or ARPA related grants and apply that to this.
Yeah, I think grants is probably the most valuable, especially just based on how many programs there are right now open. Like it's never been more difficult to follow all the grants. And I know local governments like cannot keep up, but do need that money. So I think that's a very sort of like perfect fit for these funds, especially as we move. I mean, there's still going to be, with every reporting season, there's things to do around ARPA. Audit season, there's things to do around ARPA, but other than that, it does start to become like most local governments won't really have much to talk about. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, one other thing I was going to mention, Tara, I saw you on the internal controls course, which I thought was really useful. Is there anything that we can do for smaller communities? And this would be specifically for their ARPA, for their ARPA compliance. Is there anything we can do for smaller communities after the fact, as far as they're helping them with their internal controls and their compliance? What do you think?
If they've already spent the funds theoretically.
Yeah.
I don't know about if they've already spent them.
I mean, they should
I
still
mean,
put them
before
in
the
place. either.
audit, it seems like, at least from the class, like before the audit, you can adjust things with your internal controls. So I think yes, anything to like help make their internal controls better is going to be useful in the long term for them, even if they've already spent the funds. Like ideally it would be before they spent the funds, but before their audit, especially if they're going to have a single audit, I think it would be really important to help them out with like adjusting and improving their internal controls. And we've talked about helping some of our communities with that. That's part of why I was taking the course too, was try to get a good understanding of internal controls so that we can try to help beef up some of our smaller communities' internal controls that don't have good processes. So I would say yes. I would say using some of the materials from that class as a guide. I know she said not to share out the template that we got, but we could use that internally as a guide and then make our own, template for those communities. And I think that's something I'm looking at potentially doing. Maybe not like a comprehensive template like she put out, but like maybe some guidance for one of our communities that I could then share. But so long story short, yes, I think that you could still help them even after the fact, because I think like as long as it's before the audit, it's going to be helpful either way, because that's what they're going to be checking for in that audit process.
Okay. And I was also, I guess, since we could probably assist towns with just general internal controls, and it would still fall under our very broad, our very general I guess, agreement for providing technical assistance, correct?
I think so. I was gonna say that that's something like, there's a lot of towns, and I know it came up even early on from Kara at the school government saying like, no, if the only thing that comes out of having ARPA funds is that everyone ends up with internal controls, then we've had like a success. Right? So like a lot of local governments that are especially smaller do not have anything like this in place. Some of it's because they have one, like I know one of our towns, they have a part-time person, and a lot of those internal control policies, it's like, now I'll turn it over to this person and they'll
Mhm.
review my thing. And if there's no one to like pass things back and forth with, it makes it hard to make policies, but maybe the cogs are sort of, maybe you can become that second review for folks, or at the very least, just helping them think through those monitoring processes. I think that's very much useful.
Yeah, and I think even like helping them develop, it's a little late in the game, especially if they've already spent the funds, but if they haven't spent the funds, helping them develop their policies for ARPA, to, like we talked about in the class, like that's a big part of your internal controls process, is having the policies to then make the controls off of. So I think that too, that could be a big part of it.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with internal controls in really small towns is just getting them to follow them. Because it's one thing to give them a nice policy, but you know, if it's a part-time clerk and then they quit a few months later, the next person's going to completely forget about it.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well, and there's nothing worse than having a policy that you don't follow. too.
Right,
So
Yeah.
you want to make sure that they should be adopting reasonable things, right? That's, I think, something that's hard for folks, like folks want to just take some of these templates from school. That's why they probably don't want you sharing out that policy.
Exactly,
Like,
yeah.
do not adopt this and say this is your policy. Because if you can't follow it, it's worse, because then you actually have something you're not following rather than just not having something. So some of
No,
it's
I
being
agree.
like realistic about yeah.
and one other point that, or thing you mentioned, Tara, I was thinking of taking Rebecca's template and then trying to make separate templates for smaller towns. So you would say, maybe you'd have a town, a template, a special template for a town that has one part-time employee, and then a special template, or a template for a town that has maybe 2 employees, and then a template for 3 and up, and then modify it from there.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea. That's kind of what I was thinking as well. I think as long as like you're kind of working with them in the process, because kind of like she said in the class, like now that we've taken the class, we understand a lot more about the internal controls, whereas maybe they don't. So I think as long as you're working with them to like, beef up that template and like fill it out, or maybe you review it afterwards or offer that review, then I think that's a great idea. Yeah. I'm kind of thinking similarly.
One other thing I just thought of that you reminded me of, Carlton, that I think I've seen the league talking about, but is something to definitely, I think they have a resource on it, but if they don't, something to keep in mind, staff transition. You've said this, Carlton, of like, if she leaves and then no one's there and they're not following, that is one thing that we're also seeing even in like large communities as an issue right now with, it's an internal controls issue, right? Like if there's staff turnover and then no one knows how to get into the treasury portal and no one's documenting expenditures and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
reminding local governments to have a agnostic of person process for ARPA, whether it's an ARPA email that everything goes to, or just documenting. I mean, honestly, probably an ARPA email is best for the treasury portal, so that if the person leaves, then you can still get in with that ARPA email. Although I don't know how that works with the ID me piece,
I
but
don't know either.
so maybe that
They
doesn't.
emphasized in our class, like, yeah, just having more than one person who has
Yeah.
access, or at least knowing that login information, or keeping it secure, but like having it somewhere so
Right.
that when someone leaves, you could have it.
Yeah.
And Betsy, I don't know if your hand is up again or if it's still up. I just wanted to acknowledge and see if you had a question. Maybe it's just still. Lena, can I grab your charger?
Yeah. Sorry. It's kind of, oh yeah, no,
You're good.
this owl is looking at me. I don't like it.
It's because you're moving.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know that, we have that email list set up, so hopefully everyone's on that. I know Betsy, you'd worked with Tara to get that set up, but that's like the perfect place to run ideas by people as well. I think using that to say like, here's what we're thinking we're gonna do for our communities. You know, you can also just directly email me and Tara if you want to sort of like legit run by of if it's eligible, but it is broad, so I think it's more a matter of like what's most useful for communities. So feel free to use that email thread as a way to sort of run those things by everyone too.
Yeah, were there any other questions?
Okay, so this is, and I really want to preface this, I think I did in the agenda too, that I am not replacing Kara Malanzi with this. Please, if you have questions that I don't answer here and you need like a legit review of it, please go to her courses and we'll share those.
And
But
she has office hours right after this,
oh, does
actually.
she? So you can go there and she'll
Yeah.
correct me and it'll be perfect. She'll say that I said something wrong. This is more sort of a scenario of what I send to local governments that have said to me recently, like, we haven't done anything yet, what do we need to do? So that's what I'm gonna share, and that might be almost no one at this point in the state. I don't know how many, it sounds like most local governments have reached a point where they've spent their funds. This community that I just emailed with, is not super small, and they just kind of have been sitting on the funds, so it still is a potential. So this is the revenue replacement process from school of government that I wanted to outline before I jump into mine. So you can see, and they have a really nice little infographic for it. So this is sort of, if you're going step by step, what you should do. So before you even get to the eligible projects, Marley, which I know is what your question was, they should theoretically deal with the internal controls and policies first. Now, that's not like, I mean, I know a lot of people have not done that, right? A lot of people have put the policies in place afterwards, not after spending, but after like the identification of projects and things like that. But this is theoretically the list, the order that you should go into. So before you get to the sort of budgeting piece, you're thinking through projects, you're documenting that it's eligible in one of those 4 categories. If you only have $10 million, you're just putting it in revenue replacement. And then the state law budgeting item is where the ordinance comes into play. So you've probably sent out templates of that ordinance or seen it or heard Kara talking about it. It's the one where they sort of do a project ordinance to formally adopt the funding and the buckets that it's falling in. And I think I have a template, I think, of in the slide of like what that looks like. But you know, if there's well, I think I'm gonna get to it, maybe. And then obligate and disperse is where you're sort of putting in contracts and then funding yourself, reports, audit. So pretty straightforward, but this is technically the order that school of government puts this all in. And this link will bring you to their like full sort of infographic on this. But I know I found it useful, so. Any questions on these steps?
Is there the obligation process, is there a certain document or certain content that needs to be followed to have it officially obligated?
Yeah, so I don't think unless there's something that came out of the internal controls course, but I don't think there's I think it's by agency. So
Okay.
there's several different ways that this could go, and I don't want to be the source of all the information on it, but it basically depends on if they're reimbursing themselves or if they're upfront moving funds into the budget. So the way that most of our governments have done it, and it's the way that I understand, so it's what I tell people to do, is the reimbursement process where they spend it as they would, like they spend salaries, they document it as they would, which would be like payroll records and all the sort of general stuff you'd already have for salaries. And then they just make journal entries and they reimburse themselves with ARPA funds. And I have a sample journal entry that I can share with you that our finance team put together. So you don't need to document in that, like if they're doing salaries, which is what a lot of people are doing for revenue replacement to supplant, there's no additional documentation if they're doing what they should be doing to document salaries,
Okay.
if that makes sense. So there are expectations that some people may not be following around salaries, which would be like some sort of policy about how you pay people, like a personnel policy or something
Mhm.
like that. Documentation of personnel records, payroll, data, things like that. So there could be things that they might need to think through with that,
Okay.
but if they have that in place, then that's the documentation. And then they just move money
Okay.
and reimburse themselves. There's another way where you can like upfront pay yourself, and I don't understand it, so
Okay.
I don't even tell people it because I can't give them any guidance, but I think the reimbursement way makes more sense simply because you sort of can confirm first that it's eligible before you're
Mhm.
like giving yourself some free rein with the money.
Right. I think we only have one like smaller community that used part of their funds in another category,
Okay,
right?
Yeah,
So I just want to make sure, like,
tax or something like
I
that.
think if I don't know, but we can talk about it later. But I just want to make sure that
documented
I
it,
tell them
right?
the right stuff to make sure that we have it documented, that it's like it was officially obligated.
So this document I can share with you. This is not touching on really obligations per se. Well, it kind of is because this is like a budget, but obligations would be like, it's partially the budget and it's partially like contracts that they've signed
Okay.
with, like say, so it's water taps. They've got a contract with someone to do the water taps. That's an obligation.
Okay.
So it's documenting contracts, it's documenting like payments made, and some of that's like happening in their payment system. One thing I know that some of our communities have struggled with is like their accounting system is separate from how they're documenting stuff for, like it's in the accounting system.
Mhm.
And then they're also reporting for ARPA in a separate place. And like combining those two things in one place is not like naturally happening.
Mhm.
So they just need to be communicating with finance if they're not finance on like the documentation they're going to need for the audit.
Okay.
So they might want to like pull down those contracts and all of that and hold them in a folder under ARPA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So these are the steps that I email out. Someone's gonna be like, this is wrong now that I share it with all of you. When someone says that they haven't done anything and they want us to plan. So put together your grant, well, this is when they've already sort of decided, with supplanting at least, most of them are just trying to figure out things that can fill up their amount that they received, right? So it's just department budgets. This is if they are not doing other things outside of revenue replacement. So you put together your grant ordinance. There's a template that I've linked, which everyone will see when they get this PowerPoint. You'll outline projects. And then within each of those projects, you need to include cost categories, which is, this is not actually the template, this next slide, but these are cost categories. So like fringe benefits, travel, equipment, materials. It's probably how you budget like as a cog, because we all have to follow a lot of this stuff. So it may not be weird to you, but local governments don't normally track this way, so it's very weird to them. But this is how they need to break it out. So for supplanting, what's normally happening is they're saying personnel, like that's the benefit of it, right? Is it's personnel and fringe, or salaries and fringe are the two cost items, and that's it. They don't have to go into all those other things, which is why Kara has been recommending that. So it would be, police department, salaries, fringe. Utilities department, salaries, fringe, and the amount for the total time of the program, not for the year, just the entire sort of project. And one thing to keep in mind, I don't know if this has come up with anyone, we've had a couple of communities that do not have salaries that can cover their funding. Keeping in mind which cost categories are less burdensome. So like contractual is, I think it's, or maybe it's consultants. There's one category that I know I've encouraged people to just kind of, well, stay away from construction, I guess is the short end of it, but trying to like keep them in one cost category is basically the best bet. So like the less cost categories you have, the less documentation that might vary by cost category. So, yeah. And then once adopted, they have to have it in a separate fund. It can't be in their general fund. If they've ever gotten grant funds, they should theoretically know how to do that because you're supposed to do that for grant funds. I know there's been some examples where we've learned that people were not doing that for grant funds. They have to have it separate. And that's why they then, when I was saying they do those sort of journal entries, they're basically like documenting, moving it from the separate fund to the general fund. So they're kind of reimbursing themselves from one fund to the other. So that's that process that's happening. They already spent the money, documented it the way they would normally document something, and then they're making documentation of reimbursing themselves from another place, basically.
Yeah, and if they ever have really specific questions about journal entries, I would suggest reaching out to Greg Allison at the School of Government because he's really, really good with that stuff. Yeah.
And actually, this blog post is from the School of Government, the one on my slide, so maybe it was written by him.
Probably, yeah.
Because it talks about journal entries and it looks, so I'll say, like, when I first had to start helping someone answer the questions about journal entries, I was like, I'm out. I was like, I have no idea what this even means. I had to ask our finance people like 10 times, but it actually is relatively straightforward if you've followed all the steps, like if you've done everything and sort of the document. The journal entries is the simplest part. It's the documentation of your projects up front that is more the burden. The journal entries should be sort of like a last step, like we did everything, we documented it, now we're just paying ourselves back.
And typically they should know how to do it because they should be doing journal entries for other finance reasons. So we're not finance people, but they should be familiar. And if not, then Greg Allison is definitely the best resource for sure.
Yeah. And I think this is the blog post that actually walks you through the scenario. So either the one where you're reimbursing yourself, which is the one I stick with, or the one where you're upfront paying yourself, because that is an option, but it just stresses me out. This template I'll share. So this was created by someone who's been working for us part-time for her work on Wake County's sub-award process. So we have been helping manage all of Wake County's sub-awards. And so this is the budget that she makes each of the sub-awards fill out. And there's a couple benefits to it. First of all, it just helps you break out by cost category, which some people are not really thinking that way. It also helps you break out by fiscal year so that if you can avoid certain audit thresholds. So there's sort of this like $200,000 threshold, $500,000 threshold. Most people are not necessarily hitting those thresholds with ARPA funds, but you could even use this to factor in like other revenues because there is sort of there's the additional caveats of like other federal funds. If that gets you over 750,000, then your ARPA there's a whole bunch of sort of finagling you can do with this. So this is just a good way to sort of break out how you spend everything, break it out by cost, and make sure you're not putting yourself into like a new burden. So I can share this with everyone. It's really not that complex, but I know I've used it to put together some budgets for a couple of our communities so that they can just kind of see it broken out. So before I go on to reporting, any questions on like basic budgets? I know probably a lot of you have been working on this with local governments. Is there anything that I might have missed that we should cover? Cool. So how many folks, you can raise your hand in the chat and terrible. I mean, how many of us have been in the treasury system, treasury portal? Okay. Anyone in the chat?
I don't see anyone.
Oh, Carlton. Okay.
Oh, Carlton and Sarah.
Okay, cool. So what I'm gonna
see.
Oh, awesome. So a lot of people. So I'm gonna just quickly walk through this because this is a little bit of like if local governments have issues, and then I'm gonna pull up the portal and just show you what it looks like so you can see it. We have a couple of communities that have us on their portals, which is why we have access. You can't like get access unless you're a part of a local government, but it is something to keep in mind if you have communities that are like stressed about reporting. They can add you as an individual and their reporting and you can do it for them. So I I hope at this point that there's not a single community that does not know who their account administrator was, but it's very possible that someone does. So I mentioned way at the beginning that small communities, NEUs, work directly with the Pandemic Recovery Office, not Treasury. So long ago, in like April of 2021, they all had to fill out this form, which is linked here. And let's see it. Does everyone see it when I in it? Do you see that on the screen? No. Okay. Hold on. Well, I'm not even gonna mess with it, but this is for the folks in the room. This is it. I'll put it in the chat. So some of you have probably seen this before. This is what they had to submit before there was any money in being given out. At least small communities specifically. And so they had to, on this form, designate their person. And that person, whoever they put down, was the one that had access to their portal and treasury and was getting emails from them to get into the treasury portal. The reason this became, for many folks, concerning or an issue was because someone had left, or they didn't know who they put down and they couldn't find the form, or a mayor had retired and it was the mayor and they were no longer the mayor, and all those sorts of things. So that is how people can figure out who was supposedly getting access, because that person still needs to be the one that gets them into the system, or they need to help sort of go through with treasury. So hopefully most people have sort of passed that point. Because once you figure that out, you can then add other people and remove or add as many people as you need. There are some sort of weird, it's not weird processes, but you sort of as an individual set up yourself as a user and then you get connected to the portal. So if anyone's experienced that, it would make more sense. But there's two ways you can access the portal. These are the ones at the bottom. And everyone has to like do this pre-registering process where you register yourself with your email and your name, and then you get access to the portal itself. So local governments can add as many people as they want. They just have to have that main account administrator. And then once you get into the system, you can also change who the account administrator is. So I know we've had a couple communities who had a mayor that they got in contact with, and because he wasn't the mayor anymore, and he helped them change to someone new, right? So you just have to have that main email, which has been an issue for some folks because they had no idea who they had written down originally. NC Pro should have those forms though. So if that does come up, theoretically, you can reach out to the Pandemic Recovery Office. I'm not sure who the contact would be, but we could probably ask Neil or someone else and just let you know who it would be. But they receive the forms. They should have that documentation if no one knows who's trying to get into the portal. Theoretically, everyone submitted reports at this point, so they may not have this issue. Okay, let me just quickly. I'm gonna go into the portal. I need to share. my screen. So this is one of the ways you can get in. So basically this login.gov is, if you might have actually seen it for other sort of things you need to log into the federal system through. Like if you use grants.gov, you need a login.gov to get in, I think. Yeah, so.
They changed it now, so yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so there's no reason to not set yourself up, honestly, because you probably will need it for something, but this is any individual, so this is even at the local government level, like they need to set themselves up. I know I had a couple of folks who were like very concerned because they couldn't figure out what they were like, what am I signing up for? What is this? It's just a verification system of like you as an individual. That's my understanding of it. So this is the portal, and I'm actually not sure. So we help one county or we have access to one county and one local government. Okay, so this is Goldstons, which is a small town. So I'm gonna show a couple things in case this comes up. I know some of you have seen this, so it's nothing new. If they need to add people or change who's in control, that is this section, account. So it explains here the different roles: authorized representative, point of contact, account administrator. Account administrator has control, and that's what I was saying was who they put that random name down, and that was the account administrator. You can change who is on here. So you can see we've got 3 people on here, and you can add new people, you can change roles. So if they need to do that, they would come to this space and add new people. This is where they can come if they want to add like ARPA.com or whatever, so that it's like going to everyone, or if they want to add 3 more people so that if someone leaves, they would do that in this place. And then, and of course, they need that person. So that's the trick. They need the person who has access to the account to set up and add other people. So it's something to be doing preemptively, because if you wait until someone has left, you now no longer have access to the account, if that makes sense.
When you go to add do contact, I just want to see what those
Yeah.
fields look like. Okay.
And then you can designate them as something. So account administrator would be if you want to add someone new to be in charge. I'm actually not sure if you can have 2 account administrators. I might guess yes. I think I made me and Tara. Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, me and Annie are. Okay. So yeah, you can have multiple that have like full access. And then the only other thing that's potentially noteworthy.
Knows you're presenting.
So obviously, like you can see previous reports here. The other thing that everyone had to go through, which some people may not have done, I guess theoretically, or did but don't know, is these for smaller communities, they had to submit supporting documents. Those were what they sent to NC Pro. So that's not really a great answer, but I think I had a slide on it maybe. No, I didn't. Well, there's a thing from school of government that I can share that outlines, there's 3 documents that a lot of people had no idea that they'd created and lost, that they had to submit before they could submit their project and expenditure report. So if you run into a community that has not submitted a report and has not gone into the portal, they potentially haven't done these supporting documents. And I can share with you that there's 3 that they have to submit. Someone might remember what they are if they want to put that in the chat. They have to submit those. One is, I think, the civil rights policy. One is, there's 3. And they've done them. They had to do them to get NC Pro to give them the money. So they exist somewhere, but a lot of people sort of forgot about them. So that was the other sort of challenge that we had with folks that I thought I would share. Anything else anyone wants to see in the portal? This, I think, lets us see it. So there's no current report live right now, but you can see this is how you put in information. So they break it out the same way that you should theoretically be sort of tracking projects, right? So you either have projects that are direct expenditures of you as the local government, or you have subrecipients and subawards, and you would track all of that sort of in 2 different ways. So if you're doing subrecipients, like say for the example that they're giving money to, so let's say we're NC Pro and we're giving money to the COG Association. The COG Association is the subrecipient. We'd put in all of the information here for the COG Association. The subaward is the money that we've given to the COG Association, and we would track who we gave it to, how much we gave, blah, 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 blah. if you're just doing direct expenditures, so these are less than 50,000, you would document them as sort of specific expenditures. Oh, and you also have to do it by, so it's by project and then it's by sub award and expenditure. So, and as you can see, like if you're doing revenue replacement, that's the other thing, some of you probably know this, revenue replacement, the reporting is incredibly easy. So you basically just click revenue. There's like 75 expenditure categories. You have one. So we have some counties that are like having to go back and forth, that they're like, are we 7.2? Are we 5.3 for this one? Is this one 2 point? And then it changes what you have to collect. You have to collect different information for each expenditure category. Revenue replacement, you don't have to do any of that. Any questions on the reporting portal? One thing I'll share that we've been doing, we actually didn't do it this last quarter, but we had been trying to sort of, especially, and we'll definitely do it for the April round when it's all the small communities again, sort of like hosting a reporting like check-in with everyone just to make sure people have questions. This next round should be people's second report, so they may not have as many issues, but if there's turnover or whatever else, all communities will have a report due in April of 2023. So there's no harm in throwing something on everyone's calendar for the beginning of April and just saying like, we're gonna walk through reporting and make sure everyone feels like they can get into the system. We've kind of done that a little bit quarterly with our larger ones, but we've also kind of not really done a reporting check-in per se.
We did do one the first quarter, I guess.
Yeah.
And it went really well, I thought. We had, we use ClearPoint for a lot of our reporting for our communities, so we had the staff from there on as well.
True. Cool. So let's talk through. I wanted to leave time for, I have one more slide about subawards after this, and then we can talk or not talk for however long everyone wants, but let me just pull up this slide so everyone can see it. So does anyone have any questions or examples that they want to talk through of like specific community questions, or walking through revenue replacement with folks, or adopting budgets with folks, or anything else? And it says small communities, it could be anyone, really.
I think our main challenge right now is just getting additional funding, like obtaining additional funding to help complete the projects that they want to complete, just because the funding they've received is not enough to complete the project. But it opens up what you explained at the very beginning, got my wheels turning about how we can help them in different ways, just because all those other funding opportunities qualify as ARPA assistance. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think grants are like the big thing right now. Everyone has these big projects that they need, especially on like the infrastructure side that they're trying to think through. So. Yeah.
With the revenue replacement, when you are essentially reimbursing yourselves for salaries, you're doing all full-time, part-time, contract employees, everyone that's on payroll?
So the way that, so I think it depends. So it's easiest to, I don't know about contract employees, that's what I'm pausing on. If they're on your payroll and you're not paying them differently than you normally pay them, that's a very simple reimbursement, because it's just you paid them and then you're reimbursing yourself. If it's contract, so there's some weird things that I can't remember about, like if you add them,
I'm not sure either about
like
contract
new salaries
employees.
and things like that are kind of
Yeah,
iffy.
and it depends, like obviously your funding for like how much revenue replacement, right, you could do up to the $10 million, but if your salaries are over that, you obviously can't do all of them. So you would pick like a certain, like people pick departments, like police department.
They pick like bigger ones that
Yeah.
make, so that only one, you don't want to have 30 departments with one person charging. It'd be ideal to, unless you have to just pick a department, they're all.
Right. Right.
And if you don't have enough salaries to spend all of your funding, then you should look at other
Then
expenses.
you can look at other expenses,
Okay,
yeah,
can you do both?
yeah.
Okay.
So like the town of Goldston, which is the one that I had pulled up, did her salary, she's part-time clerk. And then I guess it is actually contractual, but they had to document it as it was a contract. I don't know that they called it a contract staff, but it was the person who did maintenance for their parks.
Okay.
And they have a contract so the things to note on that, so like we had to make sure that we broke out how much they spent. They had to make separate contracts for each year so that it never went over
Mhm.
the purchasing threshold. Which is a whole nother thing. And that's state budgeting. So like, and that's like your procurement and like purchasing policy. So like micro thresholds versus regular thresholds. So like some people have different, the state requirement, I think, is 30,000. But some communities will have it lower. So that's where you like don't have to go to full bid, basically, is the difference. So you could theoretically go to bid and then not have to worry about breaking it out. They didn't want to go to bid. They had this one guy, he does their parks. But that's what comes into play if it's not salaries, right? You then have to keep mind of like all these other purchasing things.
Okay.
So that's the only thing to keep. But contractual that's basically the difference with contractual items is you just have to make sure if you need to go to bid, you go to bid. If it's under 30,000, you have to get a couple quotes. And then if it's over, you have to do a full RFP. But you can still use it as long as you comply. Cool. There's nothing fun about subawards and monitoring. I'm not gonna go into monitoring. If anyone has questions, we have a couple of, we have a lot of things. We have a ton of templates for monitoring. So if you have someone who has questions about it, a larger community, and you need like a policy or a template or examples, I know that's actually a conversation that's still happening with, like, Raleigh's been asking us about it. Some of our really large communities are still trying to think through monitoring of subawards. Anyone who's doing revenue appraisement does not have subaward, like you do not have a subaward policy. You don't need to document subawards. So this is not relevant for anyone that has under $10 million. If they have more than $10 million, this is relevant, because it is likely they don't necessarily have to, but they probably are giving out to some subrecipient for some of their funds. So this is that same sort of concept where we're a subrecipient and we have a subaward as the Association of COGS. They gave us a piece of the funding. We're working on behalf of the state to do some specific project that they don't have capacity to do. That's what a subaward would be. So the thing that I found most helpful is how to understand the difference between a subaward and a contract, because they have very different sort of things. And that's what I've tried to communicate here because that has helped me a lot. So subrecipient is the extension of the organization. So when you're a subrecipient, so if they give funding to someone to do something programmatic, where they're going to be in control of the funds, they're going to be dispersing it, doing something specific, making decisions about the program, they are going to have to follow everything that the local government has to follow. So if the local government gives to the Boys and Girls Club to do some sort of thing, the Boys and Girls Club then has to have all of those UG policies in place. They have to have the civil rights policy, they have to have the records retention policy, they have to document, they have to report in some way. The local government has to monitor them in some way. The same way that we are being monitored as the association, right? So we're all having to go through that same thing where we had to adopt all those policies, we had to do all those things. If you're doing a subaward as a local government, you then have that whole process that you're agreeing to. You're giving to another agency, you're agreeing that you'll monitor them and make sure that they follow the rules that you have to follow with ARPA. And subawards are just the money that's given to the subrecipient. So you document who the subrecipient is and you document the subaward. Contracts would be where you're just purchasing like something directly. So you're putting out a bid for supplies or for someone to mow the lawn. That is a contract. They're not doing any sort of like programmatic stuff. They're providing something for you in sort of like an open market. You would put out a request for bids. People would respond. They don't have to follow any of the UG. They don't have to have policies in place. You don't monitor them. They just agree to it, do the service for you and move on. And there's actually some really useful like 2-pagers that I've seen the city of Raleigh using, that they provide to people that are going to get ARPA money from them to check off what they are, to sort of document like this is a subaward or this is a contract. Because ideally it's much easier to have contracts in place, but if it is a subaward, you have a responsibility as a local government to document all of that. So just something to keep in mind. How many folks actually have communities that have more than $10 million that might have a subaward? Anyone? So this may not even matter for anyone on the call. That's really nice. It's really not fun.
Sarah said that they do.
Okay. Well, if we can share anything with you, so please let us know. We have a lot of templates, and I know there's been a bunch of sort of back and forth from our larger communities looking for good monitoring policies that they can put in place.
And a couple have shared theirs with us to share out, so.
Yeah, so we can happily share those with you. The monitoring process for subawards is relatively spelled out by UG. So it's actually like, if you look at, I don't know if we've actually shared out, but the contract that the COGS have with the state documents the UG process that's required. So it's like low risk, medium risk, high risk. There's all these sorts of things. And then based on that risk level, you have a certain sort of expectation of monitoring. So all of our organizations will have some designation by the state in one of those categories of risk, and monitoring based on that. It would be the same thing for a local government to do with their subawards. So do you, Sarah, are you involved in that at all? Yes, okay. I was just looking at your chat.
Yeah.
I somewhat am. My director, of course, is kind of leading the charge. I'm just kind of trying to keep up. It's a little bit more complicated, though. I've noticed.
Yes, it definitely is, because I mean, if you have a subaward, it means you have money that's not revenue replacement, right? So already there's that complication. And then I know at least in a couple, like, so the ones that we've dealt with that have subawards, a lot of them are related to construction, which brings out like whole new worlds of program income and property management. And if you're over $1 million, you have additional requirements for construction, things like that. So yeah, it's not like for the faint of heart. I haven't been involved even honestly as much as so I can't even speak to it that well. But if there's anything that we can share with you, let us know. So
Yeah, I'll share out some of the monitoring stuff we have from NC Pro released some monitoring templates. And then I think the one that we have that's a policy that was shared with us is from Durham, the city of Durham. So I'll also share that. I'll email those to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Ours is a water line extension with a town who's going to be subawarded that money.
oh, from the county?
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Okay. Well, the good piece of that is that it's a town theoretically that has experience. So I know one of the bigger issues that we've seen have been with nonprofits who have not gotten funding before. Not to say it's still a burdensome process, but at least the local government has some experience with potentially grant funds or anything like that. Hopefully. I know the biggest issues in our region have come from recipients of nonprofits with like no capacity or no experience with funding. So. Cool. Well, that is my slideshow. I'm gonna stop sharing. Anything that I didn't touch on that the group wants to talk about or ask each other? Are you leaving? Oh, you have a question. I thought you were waving
No,
by.
I'm
I'm
still
like,
here.
bye.
No, not yet. So I still have a few small towns that have not done anything. And, they, obviously, I'm gonna push them to do revenue replacement. But these towns have very few employees, like one part-time employee per town. So I want to do, I want to reimburse salaries. I think that'd be easy, but they're still gonna have money left over. So what else, what are some issues with reimbursing other things? Do I need to do it as separate projects, or what are some caveats with reimbursing things that aren't salaries and benefits? Well, in this case, I guess just salaries, probably not even benefits.
Betsy, do you want to go ahead? Looks like you have an answer.
Sure, I will. And it's pretty straightforward. Once you figure out a process, you can replicate it for multiple communities. So what I have done, yes, I have the same situation. They've got a part-time town clerk or the two fairly low-paid employees they do have. It doesn't add up to their ARPA award. So what I have done with those towns is I actually ask them to send me their fiscal year budget as amended. This would be the actual figures, not the proposed budget figures at the beginning of the year, but the end of the fiscal year. So you can reimburse going back to March of 2021. I think it's March 3rd. So if you get them to send you a budget actuals for fiscal year 21-22, you are within the window of what you can reimburse for. You can look through that actual expenditures budget and pick items to add up to the total ARPA award. And the reason that you might want to do that rather than have the town clerk or their finance person do it is because you would be probably more familiar with the limitations, what you can't spend it on. So, you know, this stuff like no debt service, no court settlements, no, you know, there's just a short list of things you absolutely can't spend or reimburse on. And so avoid any debt payments, avoid anything where there might be a conflict of interest, like you would not want to reimburse the town board's stipends because they're the ones voting on the ordinance that would reimburse them. And so that would be potentially a conflict of interest. It might be okay, but I wouldn't want it to go in front of an auditor. And so I go and pick those out. I confirm with the town clerk or their part-time finance person or their accountant that we're picking out numbers that actually do represent what was spent. And then I've literally gone in and created a grant project ordinance for them that lists those amounts using the School of Government template. And you can reimburse for anything. It could be like they spent $1,500 mowing the grass around town hall, or they spent $15,000 in utility fees for their street lights in the year 21-22. And that's so easy because they've already spent it. You know, that ended June 30 of this year. It's within the reimbursable period going back, you know, because March 2021 is earlier than the beginning of the fiscal year. That's what I've done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
And so,
Yeah, so we don't have to worry about procurement or bidding or any of that kind of stuff.
You do not. And I confirmed early on, like, earlier this year, it did look like you had to do possibly procurement rules and bidding stuff. And but Kara Malonzi at the School of Government quickly confirmed that the rules about procurement and contracting, it's not, you still have cost controls that still apply, but you don't have to go through a bidding
Yes.
process. So like if you had a garbage collection and the town paid $20,000 to a waste management company to collect town garbage, you're good, just reimburse it. And Kara's made that pretty clear based on my experience, so.
Thank you, Betsy. I may reach out to you just to look over some stuff soon.
Absolutely, feel free, and I'll gladly share whatever I can that will help.
Thank you.
Anything else? Awesome. Anything oh, audit. Does anyone want to talk about audit? Should we not talk about audit?
Carlton's like, we've talked about that enough the last 2 days in our class.
True. We can, did you already share the 2-pager we have on audit? Or?
I did, it's in
Okay.
the chat.
So yeah, that's honestly the best bet, and you can just share it with people. It walks them through it. And when I share out this PowerPoint, it'll have links to the templates too. So like the template that Betsy was talking about, the grant ordinance, it has a template to that spreadsheet that I use, the budget one, which breaks out by year. So you can do cost categories by year. I see Sarah typing, so I just want to make sure that I.
Yeah, it was really good.
Will we be able to access the chat after because I'm not logged into the Zoom. So,
Yeah,
or
we
into the
can,
Teams.
like the links and everything we're sending.
Yeah,
We could just send them all out.
okay.
Yeah,
So then the audit one will probably be beneficial.
Yeah, we can do like an email with everything in one place.
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry to
probably
make you
easiest.
do it twice.
No, it's fine.
Cool. All right. Well, I think then we are good to go. So just feel free to use you can message this group or you can message that broader email if you have questions. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. This was fantastic. Appreciate it.